A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Millicent Walker. These are the highlights of the program this week. Presidents Zelensky and Putin visit their front lines near Bakhmut as the war rages on. Also, China's leader Xi Jinping makes landmark visit to Moscow. But before that, let's check other top stories in diplomatic circles.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued an arrest warrant against the Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin and Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights Maria Lvova-Belova. They have been accused of illegal transfer of Ukrainian children. Ukrainian officials have applauded the decision of the ICC. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked Europe to speed up its supply of weapons to his country, as well as impose additional sanctions on Russia, saying otherwise the war will drag on for years. In a video addressed to EU leaders, Mr. Zelensky said it was up to the 27-nation bloc to take action to contain Russia more than 1 year into its invasion of Ukraine. The United Nations Human Rights Office says its investigators had confirmed thousands more civilian casualties in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including 21 people killed by Russian forces in executions or individual attacks. It found at least 5,987 civilians had been killed or injured between August 1, 2022 and January 31, 2023. A number it said was likely to be a significant underestimate, since it only covered those cases its investigators had been able to verify.
Приближает вот этот самый ядерный апокалипсис.
And former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev says the West dislikes Russia and China's independence, and the coming decades will not be quiet, as it will try to break Russia up into smaller and weaker states. Medvedev said Ukraine was part of a greater Russia and added that he saw no prospects for reviving Russia's ties with the West in the near future. Medvedev, who is now deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said a bid by any country to arrest President Vladimir Putin on a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court will be taken as a declaration of war. North Korea has tested a new nuclear-capable underwater attack drone that can generate a radioactive tsunami as it blamed joint military drills by South Korea and the US for raising tensions in the region. During the drill, the new North Korea drone cruised underwater to 150 meters for over 59 hours and detonated in waters off its east coast. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says he is very pleased with the level of support for his reworked Brexit deal when a large majority of lawmakers voted in favour of the storm-and-break element of the Windsor framework. The UK Prime Minister won the backing of Parliament for a key element on the post-Brexit deal on Northern Ireland, despite opposition from province's biggest unionist party and some of his lawmakers. Sunak has tried to end years of wrangling over Brexit by revisiting one of the trickiest parts of the negotiations, ensuring smooth trade to Northern Ireland without creating a hard border with Britain or with the European Union member Ireland. King Charles III's state visit to France has been postponed after a request by President Emmanuel Macron. Mr. Macron felt it will be inappropriate for the King and Camilla to travel after unions called for more protest over pension reform. The King's trip to Paris and Bordeaux had been due to begin on Sunday despite protest. President Emmanuel Macron said the legislation, which his government pushed through Parliament without a vote a fortnight ago, would come into force by year-end, despite escalating anger across the country.
The Director General of the Pension Transitional Arrangement Directorate, Mrs. Chioma Ejikeme, has announced plans by the organization to commence pension diaspora verification. Mrs. Chioma disclosed this at a meeting with officials of the Nigeria Diaspora Commission, NIDCOM, explaining that the initiative will capture Nigerian pensioners who have worked and retired before June 2007 but are now outside the shores of the country. The chairman of NIDCOM, Mrs. Abike Dabiri Erewa, commended the initiative and promised support of her commission for the project.
Officials of the Pension Transitional Arrangements Directorate at a meeting with representatives of the Nigeria Diaspora Commission on how to ensure that pensioners in the diaspora who retired before June 2007 are verified.
We have a lot of pensioners.
The essence of the verification is clear: to help them enjoy their benefits after serving their fatherland.
On our database, we have almost 5,000, pensioners who are supposed to be in the diaspora, spread around the Americas, Europe. We have some in Africa. I mean, you'll be surprised. It's like literally every country in the world, there's a pensioner there. Yes, and we are trying to see how you can be of help to us, because we have a feeling that they don't all know about our website. They don't all know about PTAD, and we don't know their organizations. We don't know the communities they belong to. We don't know how to reach them. So we feel that collaborating with you would help us.
The chairman of the Nigeria Diaspora Commission is not only glad at the extension of the verification exercise to retirees living abroad, but promises to go all out to make the intervention a success.
We will work with you, we'll collaborate with you, and let the diaspora know that Council of PTAD is a diaspora verification project that will collaborate with you to work on. We'll work on the fine details, but the first thing is to get as much information as we can from you, disseminate the information through our various platforms, start letting them know that if you are A, B, C, then you're qualified for your pension, and that it is your right, and Council of PTAD, come and collect your money.
The latest plan by PTAD targets pensioners who were under the defunct pension scheme but are living abroad to enable them get on board its verification exercise and have access to their gratuity.
The war in Ukraine is far from over as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky returns to the front lines near Bakhmut, where fighting has raged on for months. The devastated city has long been a focal point of the war as Russian forces try to revive their military campaign in the east. At least 8 people were killed near Kyiv and in Zaporizhzhia. President Zelensky has urged Europe to provide more aid, or the war could last for more years.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky returned to the eastern front line near Bakhmut, where fighting has raged for months. He met with troops and gave awards to servicemen. The devastated city has long been a focal point of the war, as Russian forces try to revive their military campaign in the east. His visit followed days after Russian President Vladimir Putin went to the city of Mariupol. Driving through the streets, his first to any Russian-occupied part of Ukraine's industrial Donbas region since the war began, and the closest he has been to the front lines. Ukrainian forces have held out for about 8 months in Bakhmut, despite taking heavy casualties in one of the bloodiest battles since Russia's full-scale invasion 13 months ago. Chinese leader Xi Jinping was also in Moscow to visit Mr. Putin. The two leaders sought to cement their nation's no-limits partnership in a lengthy meeting. They discussed plans to ramp up Russian energy exports to China, hoping to replace Western businesses in Russia. China has made strenuous efforts to avoid taking explicit sides in the conflict. According to officials, 18 persons were injured as Russian missiles hit Zaporizhzhia residential blocks. The bombardment came as Mr. Xi wrapped up his visit to Moscow. In the surprise visit, pointedly coinciding with Mr. Xi's Moscow talks, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida arrived in Kiev to deliver a message of solidarity and support for Ukraine. Tokyo has voiced support for Ukraine since the beginning of the war and joined other G7 countries in extending sanctions against Russia. But Prime Minister Kishida had been the only G7 leader not to visit Ukraine until he did. So his visit speaks volume. China's peace plan for Ukraine could be used as a basis to end the war, says Vladimir Putin, but Ukrainian and Western officials fear a ceasefire would merely freeze the front lines, handing Russia an advantage following a series of setbacks since it launched its invasion in February last year.
Former Consul General of Nigeria to Germany and Vice President, Research Chairman of the Association of Foreign Relations Professionals of Nigeria, Ambassador John Ejinaka. Welcome to Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Now, let's begin. With the talks in Moscow wrapped up, there seems to be less agreement on what will be the next step for Beijing's peace plan in Ukraine. What are your thoughts about that?
Thank you. I think China is trying to be a major player in global peace and development, looking at what they have achieved with regard to making peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, bringing them together to sign an agreement and reopening diplomatic relations. So we've seen China trying to move forward on that direction. But with regard to the talks, the visit to Moscow by sea, I will not say that there is much that has been achieved, but in terms of having to establish a template for Chinese engagement in what is happening in Ukraine. And so, I could look at it also from the fact that both of them have seen themselves as closer allies, and Moscow needs to break the circle of isolation that has gotten from the West. So having good, stronger relation with China in spite of their earlier chartered histories or relations is a good one for Moscow. But in terms, and then also you see both of them trying to reestablish themselves as partners, talking more of having a multipolar world. China also trying to show the fact that it has grown and becoming a major player in global affairs. So in terms of solving the Ukraine problem, I would not say that much has been achieved by that, because the major issues of concern to Ukraine are still there and still remain unresolved.
President Putin says many provisions of the Chinese peace plan can be taken as the basis for settling the conflict in Ukraine whenever the West and Kyiv are ready. Do you think the collective West and Kyiv are ready to accept this proposal?
For the collective West, no. Because the key issues of concern to the West and also to Ukraine is not provided in the 12-point agenda. One issue of a withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine territories has not been addressed, it wasn't included. And although one will say, yes, the very first point that talk of respect for territorial integrity of countries is one that Ukraine welcome very much, and also, well, for the West, that has been also the position China has maintained since February 2022 when the crisis started. But they have come short of actually making a pronouncement against Russian invasion. So yes, Ukraine, to some extent, yes, they will accept it because they want to keep China beside them so that even if it is for helping them not to allow Moscow to increase the level of aggression in terms of using weapons of mass destruction. Well, for Ukraine, it is good. And I know that Zelensky also had the view of maybe visiting China in future for some kind of talks. But in terms of the collective West, no. The issues contained there have not actually address some of those fundamental issues that also concern to the West. China has not actually condemned the invasion per se. Maybe the issues of nuclear disarmament and not using nuclear weapons, yes, that could be of interest to the West, because China, Moscow had from time to time threatened the possibility of engaging nuclear weapons.
Let's take a break now. Diplomatic Channels continues in a moment. Stay with us. Another thing that we've seen is the International Criminal Court issue an arrest warrant for President Putin. Are we likely to see him behind bars?
I think it is a tall order. A tall order in the sense that, first of all, the question should be, is Russia really a member of the Rome Statute? Yes, Russia signed the Rome Statute. That was in 2000. But signing does not mean ratification. They have not ratified. And in any case, after the invasion of Crimea and the global condemnation of that and the United Nations position on that also, Russia has also said they are stepping back from their signing their own statutes. So it's a tall order. If you look at also the head of states that appear before the ICC, that only happened when those people were no longer in power. If you look at the case of Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, and then you look at the case of Laurent Gbagbo, or the case of the former Sudanese president, because when they were no longer in power. When are we, unless we see an annihilation of Russia that makes it possible for Putin to become vulnerable to the point of their getting him and taking him before that. I don't see that happening, in the sense that, first of all, they have not really ratified the statutes, and they have also stepped back from membership.
How about this scenario? Do you see this scenario playing out? Concerns in the West that China's support for Russia, currently based on technology trade, may transcend to military aid?
I think China will really be careful. Even though I know there is that suspicion, I know that the Secretary of State, Blinken, was in Germany for security meeting, and he did express the fear that there's likelihood for China considering giving military aid to Moscow. But also, I know that China is conscious of the collateral impact of such action in terms of the reaction of the West. What the reaction would be? Well, they may have studied the extent of impact of the sanctions on Russia, and know whether whether they will have some kind of resilience against the likelihood of Western sanctions. But if you look at it generally, the level of Russian investments in the West is limited. China has expanded their investments in the West to the United States. Their road and belt policy, I've seen them invest in various industries in Western countries, building even underwater train stations, trying to even get as far as Germany and so on. So they have to take all those things into consideration. If they engage in the provision of arms to Moscow, they know that the consequences will also be very brutal from the West. Yes, they have intention, they're looking at what is playing out, and then they have also the ambition of reunification, or no matter through whatever means, with Taiwan. But they should be conscious of the consequences of such military support to to Moscow at this stage.
And
they also know the consequences of the escalation too.
And something we've seen is President Xi of China in Russia to visit President Putin. And then, of course, has also invited him to visit Beijing. While we've also seen Japanese Prime Minister Kishida pay a visit to President Zelensky in Kiev, pretty much the same period. Do you think that these visits are strategic? What's your reading of it?
Well, it's a great coincidence for the two leaders to be those kind of visits at that time in the same region. And we know that Japan has continued to extend non-lethal support to Kyiv, and they have not really changed their post-World War position of neutrality in conflicts. They have given a number of other help, assistance, and are prepared also to assist with the rebuilding of Ukraine after the conflict. But in terms of whether it is, well, to the West, yes, it's good. Is that also bolsters the level of support that a number of Western allies are giving to Ukraine, but also Japan is planning to host the G7 meeting, and the first initial talks on that will be online is coming out on the 4th of April, and I've extended invitation to Zelensky to be part of it, and then the major meeting is sometime in October. So, and other Western leaders have visited Ukraine, and Japan has not done so. So this is also trying to show that kind of visitor solidarity. It has not actually resulted in kind of sending weapons, which Ukrainians need so much. But I know he made a pledge of 40 million to assist rehabilitations, deal with the social consequences arising from the war, and not in terms of military support. And they're providing that money through NATO funds. So.
All right, Ambassador, perhaps just before we let you go, Russia-Ukraine war has left the West more firmly united than it has been for years. As China's relations with the U.S. reach very, or some would say, new lows, do you see Chinese leaders wanting, to avoid alienation with the West, with the EU, for example?
I don't think so. I don't see China, in spite of the low level of relationship with the U.S., which is actually as a result of China sudden economic growth, and then trying to also show that they have capacity to be a major player. I don't see them taking steps that will lead into confrontation with the West. Like I did mention earlier, they have serious economic relations with a lot of Western countries, and they are conscious of the level of collaboration and coalition among Western countries. We saw that how it was galvanized with the Ukrainian war, when there's expectations that NATO will collapse, we see a stronger NATO, we see a stronger collaboration among the Western countries, and China is conscious of that, and they will not like that kind of coalition coming against her economy, against her interests in Western countries. So, I mean, that is actually the way I will see what will be the reaction of China vis-a-vis their relationship with the West.
All right. Ambassador John Ejinaka, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
And that's Diplomatic Channel this week. You can watch this and other episodes again on our YouTube channel /Channels Web and Channels Playlist. I'm Millicent Walker. I'll see you next time.